Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world that no dinosaur could ever imagine surviving. Picture this, a place where survival was a battle not just against nature, but against every single person, thing, and circumstance trying to drag you down. Yeah, dinosaurs probably had a tough time, but honestly, they might have preferred extinction to living through the medieval period. You probably won't survive this journey. But don't worry, let's laugh a little about it. Medieval life was like the ultimate reality show that wasn't on TV, featuring unsanitary living conditions, endless wars, and a constant fight for food. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love hearing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine being a dinosaur living in the Cretaceous period. You're munching on some prehistoric plants, feeling pretty good about your giant, scaly self. Life is big, bold, and raw. But then, imagine being plucked out of your habitat and dropped into the heart of the medieval world. A world where the basic rules of survival aren't about chasing down your prey or fighting off larger predators, but instead about dodging plagues, trying to get clean water, and fighting off rotting teeth. At first, you'd probably think, what's the big deal, I'm a dinosaur? But soon, you'd realise just how lucky you were to have been wiped out by an asteroid and spared the madness that was medieval life. Dinosaurs had to face natural dangers like predators, volcanic eruptions, and climate changes, but medieval humans, well, their worst enemies were more like unsanitary latrines, bad food, and even worse hygiene. Take a second to let that sink in. Medieval humans didn't even have basic soap or proper sanitation. If you're a dinosaur, you're probably more accustomed to giant prehistoric ecosystems where life is at least in the wild and largely unaffected by human-made problems. But throw a dinosaur into the mess that was medieval Europe. That's a whole different kind of nightmare. Think about it during medieval times. Hygiene was essentially a luxury. When you were born into a medieval family, you didn't just inherit your parents' land, you also inherited a lovely array of lice, fleas, and whatever else was living in the damp. Straw-filled bedding, and you thought dealing with dinosaur-sized bugs in the wild was bad. Imagine living with a permanent infestation of insects, dirt, and disease that followed you everywhere. You see, medieval people didn't have proper understanding of germs. They had some medical advice, sure, but it was all based on guesswork and some unreasonably bad logic. They believed diseases were caused by things like bad air or humours being out of balance in your body. So, they might have made up something like, oh, the plague's just caused by some bad energy floating in the air. Better carry around a bundle of lavender. And trust me, that lavender wouldn't do much for a T-Rex trying to survive the day. Let's just say, if dinosaurs had lived through medieval plagues, they would have been the first to tell you they'd rather face extinction again than deal with medieval medicine. It's easy to laugh, but the reality is, medieval life was hard for everyone, even the toughest people around. Imagine having to deal with rotting food, lack of proper waste management, and constant fear of an epidemic striking your town. It's enough to make you wish you were a T-Rex again, taking a bite out of whatever you wanted and just living in the wild. No plagues, no rats, just dinosaurs doing their dinosaur thing. And speaking of wild, let's talk about the Dark Ages. You'd think dinosaurs had it bad, trying to fight for survival under the sun's heat, but the medieval world. That's a whole new level of darkness. Sure, they had nighttime too, but not the kind you'd expect. Medieval times were so dark, it's a wonder anyone got anything done. And you, a mighty T-Rex, probably wouldn't survive the night without a single streetlight. Only a candle here or there for guidance. Talk about losing your night vision. It'd be like trying to fight with one hand tied behind your back while you fumble for a match. Imagine being a dinosaur, dropped into the medieval world where the only way to get through the night was by the glow of a tiny candle. Your vision completely obscured by the dense, pitch-black darkness. The medieval era didn't have streetlights, so every movement had to be in the dark or near a flickering flame, constantly at the mercy of the night. Forget about hunting down prey under the stars. It's hard to see anything when the only light is from a fire that might only provide enough heat to cook a potato, let alone illuminate a giant, rampaging beast. And on top of that, the medieval world had an entire system of surviving the night. They didn't just sleep through it. No, during the medieval period, people would actually wake up in the middle of the night. That's right. Medieval people didn't just have one sleep cycle, they had two. You think the dinosaurs had to deal with that? No, while you, the dinosaur, would have been peacefully sleeping under the stars after a nice, satisfying meal. Medieval humans would be up at 2 a.m, pacing the floors, writing letters, working on crafts, or even just chatting quietly by candlelight. And don't get me started on the medieval diet. You think dinosaurs had to worry about what they were eating if you're a plant-eating dinosaur. Life is simple, just munch on some ferns and call it a day. But in the medieval world, your meal had to be a balancing act. 1 minute, you're eating what you can find, usually bread, cheese, and whatever meat you can afford, and the next, you're praying that the food doesn't come with a side of plague. Imagine getting sick just because the baker didn't clean his oven properly. That's how tough it was. So there you are, a dinosaur who's now a medieval peasant, forced to live off a steady diet of stale bread and watered-down ale. Oh, and if you're lucky, you might get a side of mutton, but you better not eat it too late, because if you do, not only will you ruin your digestion, but you might just find yourself struggling to sleep. No late-night snacks allowed in this world. The medieval world wasn't exactly welcoming to your dinosaur-sized stomach. So instead of munching on a nice juicy steak, you're munching on whatever scraps you can find, while also worrying about the plague, your hygiene, and whether or not you'll make it to see the next day. And speaking of making it to the next day, surviving the medieval period would require more than just a strong stomach. It would require a thick skin, both literally and figuratively. Imagine a dinosaur who doesn't have the advantage of being able to roar its way through problems, but instead has to face the challenges of medieval human society. There's no roaring, no tail swinging, just a bunch of uncomfortable living conditions, food issues, and constant battles with the darkness. But let's keep going. You thought surviving a dinosaur apocalypse was tough. Try surviving the medieval period, where every day was a new challenge. And trust me, your T-Rex instincts won't be enough to get you through it. Remember how we just talked about how difficult survival was for dinosaurs? Well, brace yourself, because you're now in the medieval era, and I've got bad news, it's no picnic. If you think dodging meteors was hard, try dodging rotting food, polluted water, and the terrifying unpredictability of medieval society. Survival didn't just mean outsmarting your enemies, it meant surviving everything, from horrible hygiene to lethal diseases that spread like wildfire. We've all heard the stories of medieval knights, battling with swords and shields, wearing thick armour like walking tin cans, the stuff of legend. But behind the shiny armour, there was one very big truth: the knights were often just as doomed as everyone else. And no, it wasn't because they were fighting dragons. This was the time when the real enemy was things like the plague, dirty water, and yes, bad food. Imagine, if you will, that you're a mighty dinosaur plucked from your warm, wild home. And now you're in a medieval village, trying to figure out how to navigate a world that was just as dangerous as the world you left behind. You see, medieval society was stuck in a pre-scientific time. If you had a headache, you might be told that your humours, which, trust me, We're not the fun kind, we're out of balance. And if you were unlucky enough to get a stomach bug from some tainted meat, well, let's just say the treatments weren't exactly medical miracles. Take this gem medieval doctors recommended drinking a cure made of horse urine. Sure, I bet that sounds appealing to you. What about to a T-Rex? Though I'm guessing it might not have been the cure-all it was made out to be. And you better hope you don't end up with the medieval doctor who thought bloodletting was a good idea to cure just about anything. That's right. They took sharp knives to your veins with the idea of getting rid of bad blood. So, while your dinosaur instincts might have kept you alive in the wild, they sure wouldn't have helped much with these less than ideal medieval health practices. But here's where the medieval folks had a real advantage over you. You thought dinosaurs were the top predators. Right, well, medieval people weren't afraid to do whatever it took to survive. They did have their own version of defense mechanisms, though they were probably a little more DIY than you're used to. Take, for instance, the concept of medieval hygiene. Now, if you think your scales and claws kept you nice and tidy, you would have been in for a shock. Medieval hygiene was, well, let's just say it left a lot to be desired. Let's start with bathing, or rather, the lack of it. Bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the medieval world. If you were one of the lucky few, you might get to bathe once a year, maybe twice if the nobles were feeling generous. But even then, that bath was in water shared by multiple people, sometimes entire families, and maybe even whole communities. Now, if you think about the fact that medieval people didn't really understand germs or bacteria, it's no surprise that they weren't the cleanest bunch. Imagine trying to fight a plague while your entire village smells like a giant stew pot of sweat, filth, and unwashed bodies. That's probably a little worse than the worst thing you'd ever experience as a dinosaur. You might be thinking, surely there must have been some hygiene products? Right, they had products, all right. But instead of using soap, medieval people used things like ashes, herbs, and rags, and sometimes they even rubbed themselves down with oil. Now, that's not something you'd want to do after a hard day of roaming the wild as a T-Rex. But let's say you've been living like this for a while. You're now officially a medieval survivor. You've made it past the disgusting hygiene practices, the plague scares, and the general lack of bathing. Your next challenge, sleeping something that was just as much a battle as anything else. In the dinosaur world, you'd crash down and sleep where you fell, probably in a nice patch of sun or some shady grove. But in the medieval world, sleep wasn't as simple. You think you have problems getting good sleep now. But medieval people lived in a world of constant noise, filth, and stress. Remember, they didn't have memory foam or the luxury of setting the temperature just right. Their beds often just straw piled up in a corner of a cold room. Forget about cuddling up in a nice warm duvet. You'd be lucky if the only thing that was itchy was the straw mattress. And let's not even get started on the sounds. Imagine the constant creaking of wooden beams in a cold, dark, and uninsulated room while a rat scurries by your feet. If you're thinking that sounds like the worst place to sleep, you're absolutely right. But medieval people didn't just sleep in discomfort. They had to adapt to the unpredictability of life. Their schedules weren't set by alarms, but by the rising and setting of the sun. You thought the dinosaurs had it bad with the relentless demands of the wild well. Medieval humans had their own set of challenges. Work started with the sun, and sleep came when it came. People lived by natural rhythms, adjusting to the changing seasons and unpredictable weather patterns. If a T-Rex had to adapt to this constant change, I'm pretty sure it'd be much more difficult than just finding food and shelter. Now, let's add a bit of humour to this medieval survival recipe. In addition to the plague, the dirty living conditions, and the unpredictable sleep schedule, medieval humans had to deal with the rooster. Yes, that tiny bird who woke up at 3 a.m. and decided to let the whole village know about it. And guess what? No snooze button, no cozy covers to hide under. You thought your morning alarm was bad. Imagine being woken up by a rooster at 3 a.m. every single day. That's medieval life, my friend. And now, imagine yourself as a mighty dinosaur, suddenly faced with the chaos of medieval time. You're used to hunting your meals, surviving the wild, and living with nature. But now, you're waking up to the sounds of a crowing rooster and the feeling of itchy straw in your bed. Surrounded by filth and disease, the wild you knew, a distant memory. Now, take a moment to think about all those medieval knights in shining armour. They were probably thinking, hey, I'm pretty well off compared to the peasants. I've got armour, food, and my very own horse. But, in truth, their lives weren't that much easier. Sure, they got to swing swords around and have epic battles, but at the end of the day, they were just as likely to be struck down by disease, poor hygiene, or bad food. They could survive a sword fight, but they weren't prepared for the horrors of the Black Death or the ongoing threat of starvation. It's almost laughable when you think about it. These knights, who seem so powerful, were just as vulnerable as everyone else in this medieval nightmare. It's a stark contrast to your dinosaur days. You had your own struggles. Of course, surviving as a prehistoric creature wasn't easy, either, but at least you didn't have to deal with a knight's bad breath, or medieval food poisoning, or risk dying from simply existing in a world that didn't understand health or sanitation. You lived wild and free, with nothing to worry about but the food chain, and maybe the occasional meteor or volcanic eruption. But let's keep going. You think the dinosaurs had it rough? Imagine having to live through the medieval period, where your biggest enemy wasn't just a saber-toothed tiger, but the very community you relied on for survival. Now that you've been dropped into the chaos of the medieval world, let's take a moment to pause and appreciate the absurdity of it all. Sure, we're used to watching documentaries about dinosaurs battling it out for survival, but the medieval era had its own, equally ridiculous challenges. You thought survival in the wild was tough. Try surviving in a world where your daily life is a never-ending gauntlet of plagues, warfare, and a diet so questionable it could only be described as medieval mystery meat. Let's start by considering how lucky you were to be a dinosaur in the first place. You didn't have to deal with things like medieval alchemy, where some poor souls thought the key to eternal life was turning base metals into gold, or making potions from eye of newt and bat wings. If you were a dinosaur, at least you weren't chasing after useless medieval cures. Meanwhile, medieval humans, who were plagued with all kinds of ailments, were experimenting with the weirdest remedies imaginable. They'd try anything, from stuffing animal entrails into wounds to drowning themselves in healing waters. It's no wonder most of them weren't just fighting for survival against the elements, they were literally battling their own ignorance about science and medicine. And if you think that's bad, consider the people trying to survive the worst of medieval food. If you think a dinosaur's diet of raw meat was unappealing, imagine yourself stuck eating whatever was available in the medieval kitchen. Bread was a staple, sure, but not the fluffy loaves you find today. Oh no. Medieval bread had the charm of being as hard as a rock, often made from poorly ground grains. Ever tried biting into a medieval loaf? It would have cracked your teeth faster than a T-Rex's jaw, snapping through bone. And don't even think about the other foods that were on the menu. Sure, they had meat when they could afford it, but it was often salted, spoiled, or even rotten. Imagine having a nice chunk of meat, only to find that it had been hanging around long enough to sprout a few new friends, Kea maggots. This wasn't fresh food by any stretch of the imagination. You might have been able to deal with raw flesh as a dinosaur, but medieval humans had to eat whatever they could scavenge, and often that meant risking food poisoning just to survive another day. Now, Let's throw in another layer of medieval living, the constant warfare. You may be thinking, hey, dinosaurs had to fend off other predators, but this is on a whole new level. Imagine being one of those medieval peasants who woke up to the sound of distant war drums, signalling that another lord was about to lay siege to your village. You'd be trying to rebuild your home after the last raid, only to have it flattened by catapults, or perhaps face off against a knight clad in heavy armour who thought it was his divine right to take everything you had. Sure, as a T-Rex, you could stomp through a battlefield without breaking a sweat, but medieval humans, they had to face threats from both within and outside their villages. And they couldn't just rely on their claws to get out of trouble. They had to think on their feet, literally. But even if you weren't getting caught up in a medieval battle, life was still pretty brutal. You think a dinosaur has to worry about the weather. Medieval humans faced endless winters, with barely any insulation in their homes and no way to control the temperature. If you were one of the lucky ones, you'd have a fire, but don't expect it to keep you warm all night. The cold seeped in through every crack in the walls, and frost often covered the interior of homes like an unwelcome guest. And if you weren't lucky enough to have a fireplace, well, let's just say you'd be spending your nights wrapped in layers of wool and hoping for the best. Think about it, you, a mighty dinosaur, living in a world where you had the freedom to roam and sleep wherever you wanted. Now, take that same dinosaur and place it in the medieval world, where every night meant trying to sleep in a cold, damp house, sharing your bed with whoever could fit, and still waking up shivering from the frost. Add in the constant presence of fleas, lice, and other pests that thrived in medieval conditions. And it's clear why medieval life was far from the carefree existence of a dinosaur. You could probably handle the cold and pests, but medieval humans didn't have the luxury of being able to outrun their problems. But don't think things are any better in the middle of the day. Picture yourself as a medieval peasant, waking up at dawn if you're lucky to start your day. You're not exactly strolling out to a morning coffee. You're likely stumbling out of a crowded, uncomfortable bed to start your long hours of physical labour. Forget about working out at the gym. Medieval people had to work hard from sunrise to sunset, with jobs ranging from farming to blacksmithing, to weaving and more. The medieval era was essentially one long workout session, except there was no personal trainer and no way to measure your progress. If you were a farmer, you could expect to spend long hours ploughing fields and planting crops, which meant you were walking and working on your feet all day, and probably getting little to no rest in between. You think a T-Rex had it rough during the day? Medieval humans didn't even get a chance to sleep during daylight hours. Their work was the kind that wore down your body and left you aching by the end of the day. Here's another little bonus challenge for you. Medieval cities were crowded, dirty, and dangerous. Let's say you somehow made it through a day of labour. You think the city was your sanctuary. Think again. Medieval towns were smelly, overpopulated, and filled with unsanitary living conditions. The streets were often covered with waste. Sewage ran freely in the open. And rats were your constant companions. If you thought the dinosaurs had their own problems with wild animals, at least they didn't have to worry about stepping in human waste on their way to a meal. Now, let's throw in a bit of medieval luxury, just to really make you appreciate the comfort of being a dinosaur. Medieval people did their best to make their lives more bearable, but it wasn't exactly glamorous. They didn't have modern bathrooms, soft chairs, or even proper utensils to eat with. Instead, meals were eaten off rough, wooden tables, often with the hands. Forget about the delicate dining practices of the modern age. In the medieval world, food wasn't just a meal, it was a daily challenge for survival. And let's not even talk about the medieval toilets. You'd have better luck finding a spot in the forest, trust me. And here's where things really start to feel unfair. As a dinosaur, your daily problems involved natural survival, fending off predators, hunting for food, and dealing with the elements. But as a medieval person, your survival was subject to so much more: disease, poverty, hunger, poor hygiene, and even worse, the constant fear that something, anything, could wipe out your village at any time. You didn't have the luxury of being a T-Rex, casually roaming around without worrying about your community being wiped out by a plague, a war, or a bad harvest. Think about this: even medieval lords, who were supposed to be at the top of the food chain, didn't have it easy. They lived in castles, yes, but their lives were fraught with danger from both external enemies and internal betrayals. Their food was often the same as the peasants', and their beds were no less uncomfortable. Sure, they had the advantage of not having to worry about getting their hands dirty with physical labour, but they were also more susceptible to political intrigue, backstabbing, and the constant stress of ruling over people who were probably just as miserable as they were. So, there you are, a dinosaur surrounded by a world of medieval chaos. The question now becomes, would you even last a day? Could a dinosaur, no matter how mighty, survive in a world so full of challenges that even humans struggle to survive in it? What we can say with certainty is this: survival in the medieval world wasn't just about fangs and claws. It was about persistence, adaptation, and the sheer will to survive in a world that didn't care whether you made it to tomorrow. You, as a dinosaur, had your own unique set of survival skills, but in the medieval world, those skills wouldn't count for much when the real enemy was not a massive predator or a storm, but rather the complexities of human society and the daily struggle to stay alive. Now that you've had a taste of how the medieval world stacks up against the survival instincts of a dinosaur, let's take a closer look at something that really sets medieval life apart from the prehistory. You came from the hygiene or lack thereof. You think your big, powerful dinosaur claws and sharp teeth were your main survival tools? Well, medieval humans had a different kind of weapon: their filth. You, as a mighty dinosaur, would have been right at home in a clean, natural ecosystem, free from the worries of washing your hands after every meal or fumbling with the complexities of medieval hygiene routines. I mean, think about it: dinosaurs didn't have to deal with the reality of communal public baths that smelled like sweat and regret. Instead, they simply wandered the wild, chasing prey and doing what they do best: surviving. Meanwhile, in medieval towns, getting clean wasn't exactly top of the agenda. First off, let's talk about bathing, or more accurately, not bathing. Medieval people didn't just lack modern soap and shampoo, they lacked the basic knowledge that washing themselves regularly was an actual health benefit. Oh, sure, there were a few baths here and there, but these were far from the sanitary, spa-like experiences we might imagine today. And even if you were lucky enough to have a bath, you wouldn't be alone. Public baths were all the rage, but when you went in, you had to share the space with the entire village. Imagine cramming into a tiny, steamy pool with dozens of your neighbours who haven't bathed in weeks. You can already feel the grossness settling in. Right, you might be thinking, that's it. I'll just take a walk through the wilderness and get some fresh air. But guess what? Even that wasn't much better. In the wilderness, your dinosaur instincts might have told you to keep moving, to find clean water, and to keep your skin free from infections. In the medieval world, though, you couldn't escape the grimy reality. The streets were often covered in muck. Animals roamed freely, bringing with them their own share of parasites, and there was no escape from the filth that was omnipresent. You might have been able to wash yourself in a stream or river if you were lucky, but it's not like you'd find a nice fresh patch of water that wasn't already contaminated by runoff from human waste. Talk about a survival nightmare. But wait, it gets worse. You thought the lack of basic sanitation was bad enough. Well, now let's talk about the medieval medical practices that made dinosaur survival seem like a walk in the park. If you think dealing with predators in the wild was tough, imagine facing injuries or diseases without the benefit of modern science. Medieval doctors had some of the most bizarre and, dare I say, dangerous methods for treating ailments. Take, for example, bloodletting. You heard that right. Doctors thought that if you had too much blood, it could make you sick, so they'd simply drain you of it. Imagine being a T-Rex larger than life, sharp as a razor, and finding yourself being bled out by someone who thought that taking your blood would somehow make you feel better. Honestly, it sounds like a horror movie. And, if that wasn't bad enough, the treatments didn't stop there. Oh no. Some medieval healers believed in the power of leech therapy. Yes, actual leeches were applied to the body to suck out bad blood. This wasn't just a one-time thing. People would walk into a doctor's office, expecting to get better, only to leave covered in leeches as a dinosaur. You could probably shake off a pesky parasite, but imagine having to deal with medieval medical practitioners who saw leeches as the height of sophistication. You'd have to wonder, what happened to the good old days of just eating meat and minding your own business? But don't worry, there's more you may be thinking. At least if I had a major injury, they'd know how to patch me up. Well, in medieval times, if you got hurt, you could expect some creative approaches for a serious wound. The most common treatment was a concoction of herbs, which was basically a gamble. And if you were unlucky enough to need surgery, it didn't get any better. Picture this: if you needed a tooth extraction, there wasn't a nice dentist's chair and anaesthesia. No, you were stuck with medieval dentists who had no real understanding of pain management. They'd simply yank your tooth out while you screamed, and they might have used some form of herbal remedy afterward to help. You'd be lucky if they didn't accidentally infect the wound with their unsanitary tools. So, imagine your dinosaur self scared of nothing, roaring to the sky, but now stuck in a medieval world of disease and poorly treated wounds. Okay, back to you. Living your new life as a medieval human, or worse, a poor, lowly medieval peasant. You thought being a dinosaur in the wild was tough, but at least you had clear purpose. Hunting, surviving, roaming free, no questions asked. Now, as a medieval peasant, you wake up every day, not just to survive but to scrape by. Your life is a series of back-breaking tasks, and you're constantly worried about how to feed your family, stay healthy, and somehow avoid being part of the next great plague that might wipe out your entire village. No amount of fierce T-Rex power could help you when the Black Death rolls through, wiping out half of Europe in a matter of months. You might be thinking, okay, enough with the doom and gloom. Surely things are better in the countryside. Right, well, not exactly. The countryside wasn't the answer either. Even farmers had to contend with harsh winters, pest infestations, and erratic crop yields. Imagine being a T-Rex again, thinking you've got this all figured out, and suddenly finding yourself in the middle of medieval farming life. If your crops failed, so did you. You didn't have supermarkets to rely on. There was no backup, no second chance. But wait, there's a bright side. Believe it or not. Unlike the dinosaurs, medieval people did have some moments of downtime. Sure, they worked hard all day, every day, but when it came time to relax, they had something special: medieval entertainment. Yes, it wasn't Netflix, but they had their share of fun. Think medieval jousting, folk music, and community festivals. Sure, these activities didn't exactly make up for the lack of running water or the constant threat of death, but they did offer some relief from the endless grind of survival, if you were lucky enough to get invited to one of these gatherings. You might even hear a medieval bard tell stories of mythical heroes, or if you were a real show-off, you could join in the dancing. Now, before you think about retreating back to your dinosaur life, remember medieval humans found ways to live, even in such harsh conditions. despite the constant danger, sickness, and hardship. They adapted, learned it and survived. Sure, they weren't as fast as you, and they didn't have the size or strength to dominate the wild, but they had something else: the will to fight, and the perseverance to face a world that wanted them gone. So, as a dinosaur, living in the wild might have seemed pretty simple, but now, as a medieval person, you have to survive not just the wild but human society itself, and trust me, it's not much easier. Let's take a deep dive into a different side of medieval survival. You've had your fill of the hardships like bad hygiene, dangerous medical practices, and constant food challenges, but there's one more terrifying beast you'd have to face if you were suddenly dropped into the medieval era. You thought surviving the wild with the dinosaurs was tough. Imagine trying to survive the medieval night. I'm talking about the real battle, where the darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a dangerous void full of threats, unknowns, and terrifying creatures lurking in the shadows. Dinosaurs may have roamed the earth in daylight, ruling their domain, but when the sun set in the medieval world, the stakes were high. The only thing that made this situation worse was the fact that there was no artificial light. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine it's night, and you're a dinosaur in the medieval period. No street lights, no torches lighting your way, no moonlight shining on the path. The world around you is pitch black, and the only sounds you hear are the distant howls of wolves, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, and the occasional squeak of a rat in your room. You have no modern gadgets or fancy lights to guide you, only the eerie sounds of the night and the rustling wind that chills you to the bone. You think you have it tough. Imagine a world where every single movement is a struggle against the dark. Medieval people didn't have flashlights. They didn't have the luxury of dim, soft lighting to ease into sleep. Their homes, if you could even call them homes, were dark and dank. They didn't have the cozy nightlights we take for granted. Oh no, if you were lucky enough to have a candle, it would barely flicker in the oppressive darkness. But the truly horrifying part is that this lack of light wasn't just uncomfortable, it was downright dangerous. In the medieval era, the night wasn't just a time for rest, it was the time when everything could go wrong. No city was safe after sunset. Thieves, wild animals, bandits, and even the elements themselves came alive after the sun dipped behind the horizon. For the people of the time, this wasn't just a metaphor, it was a very real threat. For example, imagine you're the unlucky one who decides to go for a walk at night. You're not dealing with urban streetlights, you're stumbling around on dirt paths, hoping to avoid a wild boar, or perhaps a band of miscreants looking to make you their next target. But here's the kicker: even inside the house, you weren't safe. In fact, nighttime inside a medieval home was just as dangerous as outside. You'd think that after a long, exhausting day of working, you could find some comfort in your home. But not in medieval times. Not only was your house dark and cold, but you also had to share your space with everyone. This wasn't a time where you could retreat to your cozy little bedroom and curl up for a peaceful night of sleep. No, everyone slept in one or two rooms, often in the same bed. You think sleeping next to your partner is a challenge? Imagine sleeping next to 7 of your relatives or your entire village. And to make matters worse, if you lived in a castle, well, good luck finding comfort there. Castles weren't cozy, they were stone, drafty, and cold, with windows too high to reach and no insulation to keep the heat in. So even if you were lucky enough to sleep indoors, you still had to battle the bitter chill of the medieval night, wrapped in wool blankets, hoping that the fire would last through the night. While you, the mighty dinosaur, could sleep soundly in the wild, surrounded by the sounds of nature, these medieval folks had to deal with constant interruptions. No peaceful naps under a tree, no quiet moments of solitude. Every sound, every shift in the air, every step you took could mean life or death in the medieval world. As if that wasn't enough, medieval folks didn't have the luxury of sleeping through the night uninterrupted. No, their sleep was divided into two phases, what we now call biphasic sleep, with a period of waking in between. Can you imagine you, a massive dinosaur, with the simple luxury of being able to sleep through the night without fear? Now, picture yourself waking up at 2 a.m. for no good reason other than that's what your body did. In medieval times, this was totally normal. People would wake up in the middle of the night, and that wasn't just a random inconvenience. It was a scheduled part of their routine. During this strange midnight time, people didn't toss and turn or try to ignore the clock. They'd get up, light a candle if they were lucky, and get to work. Some would pray, others would write letters or tend to crafts. They made the most of that still, quiet time, using it to get things done that they couldn't during the day. And if you're thinking that seems odd, just wait, it gets better. Medieval folks weren't just productive during this time. They believed that the hours between sleep phases were special. According to medieval beliefs, the time between sleep phases was when the mind was clearest. It wasn't just about getting things done. It was about tapping into some deeper well of creativity and spirituality. People genuinely believed that their best ideas came to them in these midnight hours. Historians still argue whether medieval humans had some mystical insight into the human brain. But it's clear that they embraced this time of night as a sacred, meaningful part of their daily life. In fact, many people would use the watching hour for deep prayer, reflection, or conversation, certain that whatever they thought or discussed in those hours held more weight than at any other time of day. Now, let's be clear about something. This wasn't just some odd quirk of medieval life. People who woke up in the middle of the night didn't think they were cursed or unlucky. No, they thought they were experiencing something profoundly natural, something their bodies had evolved to do. Contrast that with your dinosaur days, where your only concern during the night was getting a good, uninterrupted sleep. And suddenly medieval sleep patterns start to look like a fascinating, if strange, survival tactic. As a T-Rex, you probably had a perfectly regulated sleep schedule, dictated by the sun and your own instincts. But medieval people didn't have that luxury. Their bodies, their schedules, and their environment forced them to find a rhythm that worked. And it did, at least for them. But you didn't just wake up in the middle of the night to be productive. Oh no, you were also woken up by your environment. The medieval world wasn't quiet ever. That's right. Imagine being a dinosaur, used to the sound of rustling trees and the occasional roar of a distant predator. That's pretty peaceful compared to the medieval night. You had to contend with the sounds of people snoring, the crackle of the fire, the occasional scream or shout. And let's not forget the animals in the medieval world. Animals didn't just roam the streets during the day. At night, they became even more active, sneaking into homes and barns, looking for food, or just making enough noise to make you question whether it was time to sleep at all. And here's another layer of chaos: the fire. You may have been used to the warmth of the sun or the comfort of your own body heat. But medieval people relied heavily on fires to stay warm. These fires didn't just provide warmth, they provided light and cooking power. But if you were sleeping near a fire, it was a constant battle to keep it going, especially in a large home or village. The fire would crackle, snap, and pop, making sure you were never truly asleep for too long. It was like your ancient dinosaur instincts telling you to stay alert because danger was always present, whether it was a rogue knight, a wild animal, or simply the next round of cold weather coming in. So, as you try to wrap your head around medieval life, it becomes clear that surviving the night was no small feat. You might have been used to wandering the wild, your massive feet padding softly across the earth, your sharp senses keeping you alert. But in the medieval world, nighttime was full of uncertainties. In this world of unrelenting darkness and discomfort, survival didn't just mean battling predators. It meant battling your environment, your own body, and the very nature of night itself. And guess what? Even if you could manage to survive the medieval night, it didn't stop there. Oh no, the medieval day was just as wild and unpredictable. But let's take a breath, because we're going to dive into that chaos next. Alright, so now you've had your fill of battling the night. You've survived the cold, you've wrestled with darkness, and you've made it through the nightmarish medieval sleep pattern that kept you wide awake in the middle of the night. Thinking about life's deepest questions. You've had your fair share of challenges already, no modern conveniences, no bed in a private room, and certainly no proper sanitation. But now, we've got to talk about what happens after you wake up, because, believe me, the medieval day is no less terrifying than the night. So picture this you, a dinosaur used to having your day dictated by the sun and the immediate needs of survival. The rise of the sun means it's time to hunt. It's time to move. It's time to keep your muscles sharp. In contrast, a medieval human's day started with a jarring, cold reality often. They didn't have the luxury of sleeping until they felt rested. The rooster's early crow was just the start of their misery, but they had to get up, regardless of how hard the night was. You think you had it tough with the whole fighting for food thing? Well, the medieval world took it to a whole new level. There were no fast food chains, no grocery stores with prepackaged meals. Oh no. The peasants in the medieval villages worked from sunrise to sunset, just trying to scrape by, and the work, it was hard. Think back to your days as a dinosaur. You were able to roam the plains, grabbing a snack whenever you were hungry. Or maybe you'd go on a hunting spree for a large meal. But in the medieval world, life wasn't that easy. If you were lucky enough to be a farmer, you might get a small meal after a long day's work, but don't expect anything more than a hunk of bread, some cheese, and if you're fortunate, a tiny piece of meat. If you weren't in the position to hunt or fish, good luck, you were stuck with whatever crops you managed to grow. And trust me, they weren't always the best. If you were living in the countryside, the day started early, and it didn't stop until the sun had long since gone down. There was no lunch break or work from home convenience. Every moment of every day was consumed by manual labour. You, as a dinosaur, could leisurely walk through the forests, take naps and eat whatever was available. But medieval people, they spent their days in the fields, working the land, whether it was ploughing fields or reaping the harvest. And don't think they could take it easy in the winter months, either. Winter meant no crops were growing, which left people scrambling to survive off what they had stored. It also meant much harder labour cutting wood, keeping the fires going, and hunting through snow to find food. You'd be lucky to find a warm corner in your little medieval shack. And speaking of food or lack thereof, let's talk about how hard it was to get a good meal on a regular basis. You probably think of a medieval meal as something rich with meat and wine. Maybe the image of a grand banquet with knights and lords crosses your mind. But reality, very different. A medieval peasant's meal often consisted of just bread and vegetables. If you were lucky enough to have some dairy or meat, that was a rare treat. No one had refrigerators or grocery stores to stock up on fresh produce. So food preservation was, well, creative. They had to use methods like salting, pickling, and drying to keep food from spoiling. And if you were one of the lucky few who got meat regularly, it was probably a hunk of dried, salted beef that you'd gnaw on for hours, hard as a rock, and just about as enjoyable. As a dinosaur, you could pick and choose from the best of what nature had to offer. As a medieval person, if you were lucky, you got scraps. You probably think that sounds bad, But you can't imagine how medieval people felt. They didn't even have the luxury of modern agriculture. Sure, they grew crops, but those crops were vulnerable to weather, pests, and war. If a crop failed, so did the farmer. And without the proper tools or scientific understanding, farming was incredibly difficult. If a T-Rex were dropped into this world, it would be eating well just by using those massive jaws to hunt. But medieval humans, they had to work the land, year after year, without much change, hoping for a good harvest. That's the kind of survival struggle that makes the survival of a T-Rex seem easy. But it wasn't all just about food. You also had to be constantly aware of who was around you. Trust me, in the medieval world, your neighbours were just as much of a threat as any wild animal. You didn't know who to trust, who might steal your food, or who might try to poison you. That's right, poison. People were so paranoid about betrayal and treachery that they sometimes resorted to poisoning their rivals. As a dinosaur, you never had to deal with the human complexities of political drama. Your biggest worry was just getting through the day. But in medieval times, a simple dinner could become a life or death situation thanks to the possibility of poisoning. And if that wasn't enough, don't even get me started on medieval medicine. If you managed to avoid being poisoned by your neighbours, you'd still have to contend with the strange and often harmful medical practices of the time. Imagine yourself with an injury or illness in the medieval world. In today's world, you'd probably pop an ibuprofen or go to the doctor. But in the medieval world, well, they'd probably tell you to drink some healing concoction made from roots, herbs, or even the urine of various animals. They had a medical understanding that was, to put it kindly, primitive. Imagine you're a T-Rex, you've got a nasty cut on your side, and your medieval doctor suggests applying a poultice made of bird poop to heal it. Not only would you be horrified by the treatment itself, but you'd also realise that your chances of surviving an infection were slim. And don't forget about the lack of antibiotics. If you got an infection, chances were you'd be dead in a matter of days. Now, let's talk about a real medieval luxury living in a house. You thought being a dinosaur meant you could go anywhere. Not in the medieval world. If you were lucky enough to have your own home, it was likely a small cramped space with barely enough room to lie down, let alone move around comfortably. Medieval homes were made of simple materials, like wood and stone, with no insulation to speak of. You were left at the mercy of the weather, and if winter came, you better hope you had enough blankets to survive the freezing cold. No modern heating, no central air conditioning. In fact, the biggest source of warmth in your home was probably the fireplace, which, by the way, wasn't all that effective at keeping your house warm. Think of it as a tiny, fiery spot in an otherwise cold, damp house. It was like living in a giant icebox, only with a faint hope that the fire would keep you from freezing to death. But here's the kicker. Even if you were rich enough to afford a fancy stone house, you'd still be dealing with constant noise, from the animals in the streets to the never-ending sounds of people working, talking, and going about their day. There was no such thing as peace and quiet in the medieval world. You didn't get the luxury of a quiet, serene space to think or sleep. You were constantly surrounded by sounds. There's no way your T-Rex ears would survive the incessant noise of the medieval world. At the end of the day, surviving in medieval society wasn't about strength or power. It was about enduring a world filled with constant discomfort, danger, and uncertainty. You had to be tough, not just physically, but mentally as well. Whether it was battling hunger, surviving plagues, fighting in wars, or simply trying to sleep through the night in a freezing, noisy home. The medieval world was a far cry from the life of a dinosaur. Sure, as a T-Rex, you had to fight for food and deal with predators, but at least you weren't waking up every day to a world that demanded so much of you. You might think dinosaurs had the hardest time surviving, but after spending a day in the medieval world, you'll find that it's not all about size and strength. It's about surviving a world where even getting a good meal or a decent night's sleep was a battle every single day. Okay, let's stop for a moment and appreciate just how much survival in the medieval world depended on everything but brute strength. As a dinosaur, you might have had the size, power, and raw instincts to navigate the wilds. But surviving in medieval society required more than just muscles. You had to deal with the complexities of human life, something your dinosaur self would have had no chance in comprehending. Forget about running through forests or battling predators. Imagine yourself in a medieval village, where every move, every choice could lead to disaster. Survival was complicated. Now, we've already covered some of the more obvious hurdles medieval people had to face, like disease, famine, and lack of hygiene. But let's dig a little deeper. Imagine you've lived through the worst of the medieval struggles, the plagues, the rats, the bad food. You've braved the chilling darkness, the freezing cold, and the constant fear of being attacked by bandits or wild animals. But in the midst of all this chaos, there's something else you'd have to contend with: the medieval social system. It's not just about surviving the elements, it's about surviving your fellow humans. As a dinosaur, the rules were simple. You were either the hunter or the hunted. Life was raw and honest. You chased your prey, fought for your territory, and lived without the complexities of human interactions. But in medieval society, things were never that simple. There were kings, lords, peasants, merchants, and all sorts of other people, each with their own expectations, needs, and most importantly, their own power dynamics. Let's start with the most immediate issue, being a peasant. Congratulations, you're at the bottom of the social ladder. As a dinosaur, you didn't care much about social hierarchies. You had one rule: survive. But in the medieval world, surviving meant submitting to the authority of a local lord or baron. You didn't have the luxury of wandering wherever you pleased. If you wanted to eat, you had to work the land that belonged to your lord. If you wanted to sleep, you had to do so in cramped quarters shared with your family, your neighbours, and the occasional animal that wandered in. But it wasn't just the lack of freedom that made medieval life hard for peasants. It was the sheer unfairness of it all. Imagine you're working the land all day, slaving away in the fields, harvesting crops that will barely feed your family. And what do you get in return? A pittance, maybe. Your lord, sitting comfortably in his stone castle, has more food than he could ever eat, while you're lucky if you get a meal before sundown. Oh, and don't forget the taxes. Your lord's got to make his money somehow. Right, well, guess who's paying for it? You and the other peasants, working tirelessly just to keep the lord's castles nice and warm, just to see them throw lavish feasts while you eat stale bread. This was the system. The medieval class divide was more than just an inconvenience, it was the reality. You could work yourself to the bone, but unless you were born into privilege, you'd never escape your station. Now, as a dinosaur, you probably didn't need to worry about what the other animals were doing. You didn't have to think about being a part of a community, because your community was the wilderness. You lived by your own rules. But in medieval society, the rules were all about who you were, who you worked for, and how much power you had. As a dinosaur, you might think, well, I'll just hunt something bigger, something that can't escape me. But in medieval times, people didn't have the luxury of chasing down their problems. They had to live within the limits of their social status, often enduring it rather than fighting against it. What if you were a merchant? For example, you were a step up from the peasants. Sure, you could sell goods and get by a bit more comfortably, but guess what? The moment a lord decided they wanted a piece of your profits, You'd be paying them whether you liked it or not. And if you thought your merchant life was tough, imagine being a knight now. These guys got to live in the lap of luxury compared to most people. They wore armor, wielded swords, and lived in castles. Sounds pretty good. Right, but here's the catch: you had to constantly prove your worth. The knights of the medieval era weren't just fighting battles, they were proving themselves in tournaments, jousts, and wars. To be a knight was to be in constant competition. So, while you might think that being a knight would give you a life of ease, it was far from that. You were constantly at risk of losing your status, your land, and your wealth if you didn't perform well enough. As a dinosaur, you didn't have to worry about performing. You were just out there, in the wild, doing what you do best. But in the medieval world, you constantly had to measure up to someone else. The constant stress, the social expectations, the need to perform it was enough to drive anyone mad. Imagine trying to survive in this world, only to realize that no matter how hard you worked, how many risks you took, it was never really your world to command. And here's where it gets even more complicated. You see, medieval society didn't just care about your social class, it cared about your loyalty. Loyalty was everything. If you didn't serve the right lord, if you didn't honor the right agreements, then you were out. No loyalty meant no survival. So, you could be the strongest, the smartest, the most capable person in the room. But if you didn't have the backing of the right people, your life would be a constant struggle. As a dinosaur, you didn't have to deal with the complexities of loyalty. You either fought for your territory or you didn't. You didn't need to pledge allegiance to anyone. But in the medieval world, everything was about loyalty, loyalty to your lord, loyalty to your family, loyalty to your religion. It wasn't enough to just survive. You had to survive the right way. And that meant following the rules, bowing your head, and submitting to a system you didn't have any control over. As a dinosaur, the only loyalty you needed was to your own instincts. But in the medieval world, loyalty could make or break your existence. And if you think that's enough social drama, wait until you hear about the church. In medieval times, religion wasn't just a matter of personal belief, it was a huge part of your life, your identity, and your very survival. The church had more power than any king or lord, and it influenced everything from education to law to social norms. But here's the kicker: the church wasn't about freedom of choice, it was about control. Whether it was telling you how to live your life, when to pray, or how to treat your neighbours, the church had an opinion on everything. The medieval world was built on the idea that your soul's salvation depended on the decisions you made in this life. As a dinosaur, the only thing you had to worry about was getting enough to eat. But in the medieval world, if you didn't live right according to the church, your soul might be doomed for eternity. No pressure, right? So now, let's step back and take it all in. As a dinosaur, you might have thought that survival was all about power and instincts. But in the medieval world, survival wasn't just about your strength, it was about navigating a complex web of social, political, and religious rules. It was a world that didn't just want you to survive, it wanted you to survive according to its rules. And those rules, they were about as clear as the darkness you'd face in the dead of night. As a dinosaur, you had your simple instincts, your strength, and your ability to adapt. But in the medieval world, survival wasn't so straightforward. You had to adapt to a world filled with competing interests, dangerous political games, and constant reminders that you were never in full control of your own fate. It wasn't just about surviving the wild, it was about surviving the system. And trust me, the system was as brutal as any T-Rex battle you could imagine. So, you've managed to survive the medieval world so far, dodging plagues, battling against the elements, and dealing with the madness of medieval politics. But guess what? There's one more hurdle we need to discuss that might just have you wishing for the good old days of wild dinosaur roaming. This is something that every medieval person, from the lowliest peasant to the highest lord, had to contend with. It's the thing that made life in the medieval period feel like an unending cycle of suffering, and something no T-Rex could ever have imagined facing the medieval diet. Yes, you heard me right. The thing that could break a person's spirit even more than a long winter or a deadly plague. You might be thinking, wait, how could food possibly be a challenge for a giant creature like me? Dinosaurs ate whatever they wanted plants. Other animals, it was all on the menu. Well, that's true, but here's the kicker: medieval people didn't have that luxury. Instead, they had to struggle with the simplest of daily challenges: what's for dinner? Let's dive into it. Imagine you're living in the medieval period, and you're a humble peasant working the land. The first thing to know is that meals were incredibly basic. You didn't have a variety of meats and vegetables to choose from. Instead, you were stuck with whatever you could grow or scavenge. Bread was the staple, and it wasn't the delicious, fluffy loaf you might imagine today. Oh no, medieval bread was often hard and crusty, made from a mix of whatever grains you could get your hands on, usually of questionable quality, if you were lucky. You might get some butter or cheese to go with it, but honestly, most of the time, you were stuck with the bread. And don't get me started on vegetables. You had what the season provided, and the idea of fresh produce was a myth. Everything was either preserved, pickled, or dried, and nothing screamed yum quite like a jar of sour cabbage. Even the fanciest of meals for the wealthy could be nothing more than roasted meat served with some stale bread and the occasional spoonful of mustard to mask the taste. You might think this is funny, but for medieval people, this was an actual treat. And yet, you, as a dinosaur, might have easily lived off a better diet. Can you imagine a T-Rex having to eat something that's half rotten just to survive? And if you're thinking, all right, so they ate badly, at least they had meat. Well, hold on. Meat was a rare luxury in medieval times. And even when you had it, you didn't always enjoy it. The animals you hunted, raised, or ate were often preserved using salt, a process that didn't exactly preserve the flavour. Salted beef, salted pork, salted fish, whatever you had, it was sitting in salt for months, possibly growing more salt than actual meat. And let's not forget the wonderful delicacies like pottage, a stew made from whatever scraps you could throw together, including peas, barley, and maybe a little meat if you were lucky. But that's the thing: if you were lucky, most of the time. Pottage was more about what you could find than what you actually wanted. Now, I know what you're thinking. This doesn't sound so bad. I could probably manage with this diet. But here's where it gets real. The worst part of the medieval diet wasn't just the lack of food variety, it was the quality. You see, medieval people didn't know about things like nutrition. They didn't know about vitamins, or minerals, or even basic food safety. If the bread was mouldy, they'd scrape off the top and eat the rest. If the meat was tough, well, that's what a good stew was for. Right. They didn't understand how food could go bad in dangerous ways. And guess what? They didn't always have clean water to wash it down. They drank ale or wine most of the time, both of which were often safer than the local water supply, which might be contaminated with everything from human waste to animal waste. So, while you, as a dinosaur, had the luxury of drinking water from clean streams and lakes, medieval humans were busy trying to stay hydrated with whatever fermented liquid they could make. This brings us to the real danger of the medieval diet: the risk of disease. You probably thought it was hard enough to survive in the wild, fighting off predators and avoiding environmental dangers. But now, imagine that the food you eat every day could actually make you sick without you even realizing it. Medieval people ate food that was often spoiled, rotten, or otherwise unsafe, and they had no idea how to avoid foodborne illnesses. They didn't understand bacteria or viruses, but they knew that food poisoning was a common threat. That tasty salted pork you thought was a treat, it could have been crawling with bacteria, giving you a case of food poisoning that could send you to your grave. If you were unlucky enough to eat spoiled food, well, that's a death sentence in a world where there were no antibiotics to save you. And then there was the issue of lack of refrigeration. As a dinosaur, you didn't need to worry about food spoiling. Nature took care of that. If you were a carnivorous dinosaur, you probably ate your meal fresh, right off the bone. But in the medieval world, they had no way of keeping meat fresh for long periods. Once they killed an animal, they had to preserve it somehow. And this meant that everything, whether it was meat, fish, or cheese, had to be stored in a way that could last for weeks or months. They used salt, smoke, and drying methods. But these preservation techniques didn't make the food taste any fresher. You, as a T-Rex, probably had the pleasure of fresh, juicy prey, and you didn't have to worry about it tasting like it had been sitting in the sun for days. Not so for medieval humans. But wait, there's more. Imagine you're stuck in a medieval village, struggling with this monotonous, dangerous diet, and then, just when you think you can't handle it anymore, bam, you get a great big plague for dessert. That's right. You were living in a world where your body was constantly fighting off disease, not just from poor food choices, but from the environment around you. Medieval towns were breeding grounds for illnesses, and with unsanitary conditions, people were at constant risk of infection. You thought the dinosaurs had it bad when they faced extinction from a meteorite, but they didn't have to deal with things like black rats carrying fleas that spread the bubonic plague. No, the plague was the real killer in the medieval period, and as a peasant or a knight or anyone in between, you were just as vulnerable to the outbreaks as anyone else. No matter how hard you worked, no matter how strong you were living in constant fear of falling ill. Now, let's talk about survival again. Remember how dinosaurs had the instinct to hunt, fight, and adapt well. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just about fighting predators, it was about fighting the system. Imagine spending your days working the fields, struggling with bad food, and constantly fearing for your health. And when you finally think you've had enough, you're hit with the harsh reality that your survival doesn't just depend on your strength or cunning. It depends on how well you can navigate the harsh, unfair world of medieval politics, religion, and most importantly, food. You could survive a battle with a lion, but could you survive the medieval diet? Now that's a challenge. So, by now, you're well aware that surviving the medieval period was an exercise in endurance. It wasn't just about fighting off wild animals or battling nature's toughest challenges. It was about living in a world where every aspect of life, from what you ate to when you slept, was riddled with danger, uncertainty, and inconvenience. We've covered a lot of the major survival struggles: hygiene, food, social hierarchies, political intrigue. But there's one final element of medieval life that you, as a dinosaur, would truly struggle with: the constant presence of disease. Now, you might be thinking, hey, I'm a dinosaur, I'm strong, resilient, and I've survived some of the toughest environmental challenges the world has ever seen. How hard can disease be, but medieval people? Well, let's just say they were dealing with diseases that were more catastrophic than any meteor strike could ever be. And as a dinosaur, you'd be completely unprepared for it. Imagine the scene: you're now a medieval human, navigating a world where the very air you breathe could carry sickness. You've survived the cold nights, the lack of food, and the constant physical labour. You've learned to adapt to the complex social structures, the ever-present danger of thieves, and the horrific medieval medical practices. But there's one thing you can't escape: the diseases that ravaged the population. Medieval Europe was no stranger to some the most deadly pandemics in history. And these weren't just the occasional illness that swept through a village. These were entire waves of death that wiped out entire communities in a matter of days. Let's start with the biggest and most infamous of them, all the Black Death. This pandemic is one of the most notorious in human history. And if you were a dinosaur dropped into the medieval world, you wouldn't have any defences against it. The Black Death was caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium, which spread quickly through fleas that infested black rats. The rats would travel with merchants, armies, and even through the ships that crossed the seas. Imagine the scene. Your medieval world is already a nasty, grimy place. You're trying to survive as best you can. And then, without warning, the plague starts to spread. People fall ill almost overnight, suffering from fever, chills, and the appearance of painful buboes, or swollen lymph nodes, which were often the size of a fist. You might be thinking, surely, as a mighty T-Rex, I could just shake off something like that. Right, but the thing is, medieval people had no idea what was causing the disease, let alone how to treat it. They didn't understand hygiene, they didn't know about bacteria, and they certainly didn't have any way to stop the plague in its tracks. In fact, the best advice they could give was to pray and hope the disease would somehow leave. And if you thought the Black Death was bad, it wasn't the only plague to ravage the medieval world. There were other waves of the plague, including the third cholera pandemic, the Spanish flu, and numerous other outbreaks that took countless lives. You would have been living under the constant threat that any day now a new disease could strike. As a dinosaur, you probably wouldn't have to worry about these sorts of things. Sure, predators and the environment might have taken a toll, but diseases that wiped out entire species, not in your wheelhouse. But let's not pretend that the Black Death was the only thing on the medieval plague menu. Imagine, if you will, living in a world where diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, and typhus were everyday occurrences. In fact, medical records from the time show that outbreaks were incredibly common. Medieval humans lived with the constant threat of these diseases, and they had no idea how to stop them. Smallpox, for instance, could disfigure its victims and leave them with permanent scars. Typhus, spread by lice, could cause fever, rash, and death. You, as a mighty dinosaur, had no concept of these diseases. And let's face it, there's no amount of strength or sharp claws that could protect you from something like that. The medieval world was a bacterial petri dish. And you, as a dino in this world, would have been just as vulnerable as everyone else. But here's where it gets truly frightening. Medieval humans didn't just face one disease after another, they faced the ignorance of their times. Imagine yourself as a medieval human. You've got the plague, you've got smallpox, and now you're hearing rumours about witches causing disease. Yes, that's right, witch hunts. If you were unlucky enough to be suspected of witchcraft during an outbreak, not only would you face the dangers of disease, but the threat of being tortured or executed. This wasn't a time of rational thought or science. It was a time when superstition ruled. People believed that evil forces were behind diseases. If a crop failed, it was because of witchcraft. If someone got sick, they might be accused of bringing bad luck or dark magic into the community. Imagine you're already struggling to stay healthy, and now you have to fight off accusations of witchcraft on top of it. You, as a T-Rex, might have a pretty simple life. But in the medieval world, surviving meant dodging both biological threats and human paranoia. And let's be honest, it wasn't just diseases that medieval people had to worry about. It was also the constant threat of starvation. While we've talked about how the medieval diet was limited and unappetizing, the real kicker was that the food didn't always come through. Sure, you had the basic crops, but if the harvest was bad, you were out of luck. It wasn't just a matter of eating bland bread for a few days. A bad harvest could lead to famine, And when famine struck, it didn't just mean a bit of hunger, it meant death. People would starve. And even those with a little more money weren't safe. In fact, famine was one of the most devastating forces in medieval life. Even the strongest knight couldn't survive on nothing but stale bread, you might think. Well, I'm a dinosaur. I can find food in the wild. But medieval people didn't have that luxury. A bad harvest or a crop failure could wipe out entire villages. And it wasn't uncommon for people to resort to desperate measures. During one of the most severe famines, some people resorted to cannibalism just to stay alive. Imagine living in a world where your worst fear wasn't predators, but the fear that your food supply might suddenly disappear. The fact that humans had to survive this kind of uncertainty every year is a testament to their endurance. But let's keep it real, you, as a dinosaur, might have faced your own challenges with hunger, especially during harsh seasons. But you never had to face the terror of seeing your family starve or worse, watching your neighbours eat each other just to stay alive. The medieval world wasn't just about physical strength, it was about survival. In a society where every day was a battle against food shortages, disease, and social chaos. And while it might seem like the medieval world was one big survival game, it was also a place where people had to live with the uncertainty of it all. They didn't know what caused diseases. They didn't understand how to protect themselves. They had no idea how to stop plagues, fight famine, or even ensure they could live a healthy life. They simply survived as best they could, day after day, hoping that they'd wake up tomorrow to face a new day with a little more luck. As a dinosaur, you might have had your own survival instincts, your strength, and your ability to adapt. But in the medieval world, your survival depended on so much more. It wasn't just about hunting or fighting. It was about navigating a world that had no idea how to protect itself, where disease, famine, and superstition were the true predators. The medieval world was harsh, unforgiving, and downright brutal. It wasn't just the elements you had to fight, it was the world itself, in all its ignorance and suffering. If you thought being a dinosaur in the wild was the toughest challenge, try living in a world where survival was constantly up for grabs. You've already lived through some of the harshest challenges that medieval life could throw your way. The endless struggles for survival against diseases, the dangerous lack of hygiene, and the ever-present threat of starvation. But if you think that's where the medieval difficulties end, I have some bad news for you. You see, we've been talking about the basics, the things you need to survive: food, shelter, health. But there's one thing that's even worse than the fight for basic survival: living through a world of endless social and cultural expectations. So, if you thought being a dinosaur meant just focusing on surviving and enjoying a bit of peace in the wild, you're going to have a tough time adjusting to medieval life, where survival didn't just mean fending off predators or finding food. Survival here meant navigating a labyrinth of social rules, obligations, and expectations that would make even the most resilient dinosaur think twice about trying to fit in. Medieval society was not only brutal, but it also came with layers upon layers of social pressure, tradition, and control that affected every person, no matter their class. For you, a dinosaur with a relatively straightforward existence, the mental gymnastics required to survive within medieval society would have been utterly baffling. Let's start with the most basic thing: medieval people had to deal with the feudal system. It sounds complicated, doesn't it? Well, that's because it was. You see, medieval life revolved around the idea that you owed your loyalty and service to someone above you in exchange for protection, land, or food. Imagine living in a world where everything you did, every action, every choice was influenced by who you owed allegiance to. As a dinosaur, the closest thing to this would have been being part of a food chain. You eat what's below you, and you're hunted by what's above you. But in medieval society, human life wasn't that simple. You could be born a peasant and stuck at the bottom, working the land for a lord, or you could be born into nobility, enjoying luxuries most could only dream of. But here's the twist: no matter what position you were born into, you had obligations to fulfill. If you were a lord, you had to protect your peasants and fight in wars for your king. If you were a peasant, you had to work the land for your lord and obey their orders. As a dinosaur, you didn't need to deal with these kinds of structures. You just lived, hunted, and existed. But in the medieval world, the structure was everything. Your life didn't belong to you, it belonged to the system. And there were rules you had to follow if you wanted to survive. Forget about roaming free. You were constantly tied to a social contract that defined your life, your work, and your place in society. The harsh reality was that survival didn't just depend on your physical strength, your instincts, or your ability to hunt. It depended on your ability to navigate a system that was designed to keep you in line, no matter how hard you worked. So what would you do if you were stuck in this social hierarchy, constantly trying to live up to the expectations of others? Well, in medieval times, you had no choice but to accept your place as a peasant. You had no real rights, you worked the land for a lord, and could be thrown out if you didn't comply with their wishes. If you were a noble, you were constantly at war, trying to protect your land, expand your influence, or fight for your king. If you were a merchant, you had to navigate the laws and regulations imposed by both the nobility and the church. You were always climbing or falling down a social ladder, and your survival depended on how well you understood and played the game of loyalty and obedience. It wasn't just physical strength you needed, it was social agility. And don't think for a second that the medieval church didn't play a huge role in keeping everyone in line. The church wasn't just a place of worship, it was a powerful political force that controlled everything from laws to education. Imagine being a medieval human, and your entire life is shaped by religious beliefs. Every decision you make, every action you take, is governed by what the church deems acceptable. You want to marry, the church decides. You want to leave your village, the church decides. You want to think for yourself. Well, good luck, because the church had a way of silencing dissent in ways that would make any medieval lord proud. But here's the real kicker: even if you were lucky enough to be born into the church, you still weren't free. You see, the church also had strict expectations for its clergy, and there was always a power struggle within the religious community. If you were a monk, for example, you had to live by an incredibly rigid set of rules. No talking, no eating before the bell rang. And, of course, no thinking for yourself. Your entire existence was dedicated to serving God and following the church's doctrine. You might think, oh well, monks get to live in peace, away from all the madness of the medieval world. But the truth is, monks weren't exempt from the social pressure of survival. They were subject to the same rigid expectations of obedience and loyalty. Their survival depended not on their ability to think for themselves, but on their ability to follow the rules of the church. Now, let's take a step back and consider the physical side of survival in this social system. You'd think that, as a dinosaur, you could easily rely on your sheer physical strength to survive. But in the medieval world, physical strength was only a small part of the equation. Survival depended just as much on your ability to work within the system, to build relationships, and to follow the rules. If you didn't have land, you didn't survive. If you didn't have a patron to support you, you were out of luck. And while you might be able to fight off a wild animal in the forest, surviving in the medieval world meant being able to fight off other people, whether it was a rival knight, an angry peasant, or a greedy merchant looking to steal your livelihood. And speaking of thieves, let's talk about the danger that medieval life brought from within society, you might think. Well, at least I don't have to worry about the bad guys when I'm hunting in the forest. But in medieval society, the bad guys weren't always lurking in the shadows. They were your neighbours, your fellow villagers, your fellow peasants. Medieval towns and villages weren't exactly the safest places to live. If you were a peasant, you had to worry about bandits, thieves, and desperate people who would do anything to survive. No one was safe, even in their own homes. The threat of violence was constant, and the law was often out of reach for the poorest members of society. You thought it was hard dealing with predators in the wild. Try surviving in a world where your fellow human beings were just as much of a threat to your survival as the wolves in the forest. But here's the interesting part. Medieval society didn't just create these survival pressures for the lower classes. It also created pressures for the rich and the noble. The higher up you were in the social hierarchy, the more responsibilities you had. Sure, you had a warm bed, a fancy meal, and all the luxuries that peasants could only dream of. But you were also constantly under pressure to prove yourself as a lord. You had to defend your land, expand your influence, and keep your people in line. Failure to do so meant being deposed or losing everything you worked for. You might think the nobility had it easy, but in reality, they were just as trapped by the system as anyone else. The higher you were, the harder you fell. Medieval society was built on a precarious balance, and you had to navigate it with skill if you wanted to survive. In the end, surviving in the medieval world wasn't just about physical strength, or even just having the right food and shelter. It was about navigating a complex web of social expectations, political pressure, and constant danger from both outside forces and your fellow humans. As a dinosaur, you could rely on your instincts and strength to make it through the day. But in medieval society, even the strongest and most capable individuals were subject to forces far beyond their control. Your survival depended on your ability to adapt to a world filled with complicated rules, unpredictable people, and a system that cared little for your own wants or needs. By now, you've seen just how tough life could be in the medieval period. From diseases like the Black Death to the harsh realities of the feudal system, medieval life was a constant struggle. But let's not kid ourselves into thinking that survival was all about battling plague, hunger, and social norms. Oh no. There's one more crucial aspect of medieval existence that makes it all the more painful to imagine medieval warfare. You thought battling predators in the wild as a T-Rex was tough. Well, strap in, because medieval warfare was a brutal, bloody, and almost comically complicated affair. Unlike the clear-cut battles you might face in the wild, where you could rely on raw power, survival instincts, and the occasional roar, medieval warfare was an exercise in chaos, strategy, and sheer brutality. As a dinosaur, you might have only had to fend off other wild creatures and the elements, but medieval humans had to fight their own kind. And let me tell you, these guys didn't go down easy. There's nothing quite like a knight in full armour, wielding a sword as long as your body, coming at you with the intent to do nothing but kill. Now, imagine yourself in the thick of it. You're standing in a battlefield, armed with nothing but a spear or a sword, and you're fighting for your life. Now, as a T-Rex, you're used to the idea of power. Strength is your game, and when it comes down to fighting for your survival, you're the king of the jungle. But here's where it gets tricky. Medieval humans didn't fight like animals. They fought with weapons that were designed to take down mighty creatures like you, specifically designed to pierce armour, deliver fatal blows, and overwhelm opponents with sheer numbers. You thought your teeth and claws made you a dangerous opponent. Try facing an entire army of soldiers equipped with crossbows, longbows, and swords forged specifically to bring down larger prey. Medieval humans didn't just rely on brute strength like you. They had technology on their side. First, let's talk about the battlefields themselves. Forget the peaceful plains where you, as a dinosaur, roamed freely when humans fought. They did so in muddy, crowded battlefields. Imagine the sounds, the clash of steel on steel, the pounding of hooves, the screams of men, and the shrill twangs of arrows flying past you. It's chaos, total chaos, and you, a mighty dinosaur, are stuck in the middle of it. There's no room to run or hide or occur. And remember, these battlefields were often not just about your strength or your ability to fight one-on-one. Strategy was key. Unlike a T-Rex's predatory instinct, medieval soldiers were trained to fight in formations, use shields and armor to protect each other, and coordinate their attacks to overwhelm their enemies. You might think that just because you were big and strong, you'd easily win a fight, but in the world of medieval warfare, you had to deal with group tactics. And in a group, strength is important, but it's not the only thing that counts. Let's break this down a bit further. You might be wondering, what could possibly be worse than facing a full-scale battle? Well, how about facing the siege warfare that medieval armies loved so much? A siege, for those of you who might not know, is when an army surrounds and starves out a fortification. It sounds like something out of an action movie. Right, but for medieval people, it was a brutal fact of life. You've got a castle, a stronghold, and you think you're safe. But then an army comes, surrounding you, cutting off all your food and supplies. You could try to defend yourself with walls and weapons, but there was no escape. In the meantime, the enemy is launching catapults, throwing flaming arrows, and using siege towers to break down your defences. Meanwhile, your food is dwindling, the pressure is on. If you're lucky enough to survive the siege, you'll have to deal with the aftermath, and trust me, it's not pretty. Imagine yourself as a T-Rex in this scenario. You'd have no idea what to do. You're used to hunting alone, pouncing on your prey, and dealing with the threat of other creatures in the wild. But medieval humans, they fought as units. You might be big and terrifying, but you're not trained for this kind of conflict. Sure, you can stomp on a few soldiers, maybe tear through some wooden structures, but you're still going to be overwhelmed. The medieval military machine is built to break you down, and when they manage to breach your defences, it's game over. But the worst part of medieval warfare wasn't the violence, it was the sheer pointlessness of it. Wars weren't just fought over land or resources, they were fought over politics, power, and feuds that lasted for generations. Imagine being part of a medieval army, sent to war over a piece of land that, at the end of the day, meant nothing to you. You could fight and die, only to have the power dynamics shift, and your lord could lose everything he just gained. It's a never-ending cycle of violence and futility. Even the most noble knights, those who fought for honour and glory, were often caught in these senseless wars, constantly battling not for survival, but for their lord's survival. As a dinosaur, you had one goal: survive. But in the medieval world, survival didn't just depend on how well you fought, it depended on which side you were on. Now, let's switch gears and talk about the after effects of battle. Sure, you might have won the battle or the siege, but the reality is, you're still in a world where life isn't just about surviving physically, it's about surviving psychologically. After battle, soldiers often returned home only to face trauma. The things they had seen, the violence, the deaths lingered with them. But here's the kicker: medieval society didn't understand mental health. They didn't know what PTSD was. If you came back from a battle, covered in blood, shell-shocked and scared, the most you could expect was a pat on the back and maybe a little more ale to drink. The medieval world had no care for what the trauma of battle did to its soldiers. You'd come back, barely alive, and be expected to get back to work without any recognition of what you had been through. Can you imagine that as a T-Rex? You were all about surviving the immediate dangers, fighting to eat and stay alive. But if you were a medieval person, you'd come back from battle and have to live with the consequences. It wasn't just about surviving the war, it was about living with the aftermath, a weight that most soldiers carried with them for the rest of their lives. And to top it all off, we haven't even touched on the most ridiculous aspect of medieval warfare, the armour. You thought a T-Rex had it bad with its scales and massive size. Imagine a knight, encased in heavy metal armour, barely able to move, unable to see properly through the visor of their helmet, and drenched in sweat from the sheer weight of it all. Medieval knights were essentially walking tanks, but not the cool, efficient kind. These suits of armour were ridiculously heavy, often weighing over 50 pounds. You could barely move, and if you were knocked down, good luck getting back up without assistance. It was like being stuck in a giant metal cocoon, completely vulnerable to the enemy's attack. If you were a dinosaur, you'd probably laugh at the idea of such clunky gear, but for the medieval knight, it was their only means of survival in battle. The thing is, this armour didn't make them invincible, it just made them a slow-moving target. The medieval battlefield was a place of inefficiency and chaos, nothing like the efficient predatory strategies you'd employ as a T-Rex. Now, let's take a moment to consider what all of this means for survival as a dinosaur. You survived by understanding your environment, adapting to the world around you, and relying on your instincts. In the medieval world, though, survival wasn't just about instincts, it was about outsmarting your enemies, living by the rules of the social system, and relying on technology and strategy to stay alive. Sure, you might have been powerful, but in this world, power was diluted by politics, religious constraints, and a never-ending cycle of warfare. The world of the dinosaurs was harsh, but the world of the medieval humans was nothing short of relentless. All right, so you faced everything that medieval life had to throw at you: plagues, starvation, political intrigue, warfare, and a society that demanded your obedience at every turn. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? And by now you're probably wondering, how much worse can this get? Well, brace yourself, because there's one last thing we need to talk about, the thing that stands between medieval survival and ultimate madness, the endless cycle of medieval superstition. You, as a mighty dinosaur, probably didn't spend much time thinking about the spiritual forces that governed your world. You didn't have to deal with priests, magic, or the constant belief that the universe was out to get you. Your survival was pretty straightforward, but in medieval times, the world was ruled by forces far beyond the natural world. If there's one thing that the people of this era excelled at, it was the art of superstition, belief, and magic. And if you thought the constant battles for survival were hard enough, try navigating a society where your life could be decided by some illogical belief or an accusation from a neighbour. Imagine yourself, now a medieval person, caught in the crossfire of superstition. The world around you was constantly filled with mystical forces, and not in a good way. Everything, every illness, every disaster, every bad harvest was seen as the result of magic or divine retribution. If you woke up with a headache, it wasn't just a headache, it was a sign that you had been cursed, or that an evil spirit was haunting your house. Did you spill salt? You'd better be ready to toss a pinch over your left shoulder to undo the bad luck, or else you'd face the consequences. But it didn't stop there. No, you didn't just face these superstitions on your own. Society, at large, believed in them too, and they were incredibly judgmental. A bad harvest wasn't just bad luck, it was seen as a sign of divine wrath. If your cows died unexpectedly, people would look at you sideways, whispering that you must have done something to anger the gods. And don't even get me started on the witch hunts. If you were a medieval person, you were living in constant fear that anyone might accuse you of witchcraft. All it took was a bad crop, a poorly timed illness, or a neighbour's jealousy, and you could find yourself tied to a stake, burned alive, or worse, simply because someone thought you were practicing dark magic. A T-Rex, used to the natural order of life, would be able to laugh at the absurdity of this. But in medieval society, these superstitions were deadly. As a dinosaur, you had no time for the whims of gods or witches. If you were hungry, you hunted. If you were tired, you rested. There was no divine interference in your daily existence. But in medieval times, survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about being seen as righteous in the eyes of the community. Whether it was appeasing the gods, paying homage to saints, or ensuring your soul was cleansed through constant confessions, your survival hinged on your reputation. It wasn't enough to be strong. You had to be seen as virtuous, or else you might find yourself marked for death, or worse, a lifetime of punishment. So now, imagine living in a world where everything, absolutely everything, was seen through the lens of divine or magical influence. Let's say you went for a walk and saw a black cat. In most modern societies, it's a harmless little creature with an adorable gaze. But in medieval Europe, you might just have cursed yourself. Seeing a black cat was often considered a bad omen, a sign that death or misfortune was just around the corner. Imagine your life being filled with this kind of paranoia. The reality was that medieval people lived in a world that was more magical than it was rational. A bird flying into your house, a bad omen, a full moon. Time to stay inside or risk falling prey to supernatural forces, a T-Rex. You didn't need to worry about omens or signs. Your world was clear and direct when you were hungry. You ate when you were threatened. You fought. That was the simplicity of survival. But for medieval humans, survival was an endless game of interpreting the signs in the sky, the strange movements of the stars, and the patterns of the winds. Now, you may be thinking, okay, but surely in the face of all this superstition, there were rational thinkers, philosophers, or scientists who challenged these beliefs. Right? Well, sort of. But it wasn't until much later in history that any real scientific reasoning took hold. For the majority of the medieval period, religion and the church were the dominant forces that shaped people's lives. As a result, the knowledge that was handed down to the masses wasn't based on fact, but on faith. People didn't understand how the human body worked, how diseases spread, or why crops failed. They didn't have a clue about things like bacteria or viruses. Instead, they turned to the church, or worse, to witchcraft and alchemy. In fact, alchemists were seen as some of the most respected scholars of their time. But what did they actually do? Well, they spent their lives trying to turn base metals into gold, or discover the secret to eternal life, at least. That's what they thought they were doing. And while you, as a T-Rex, relied on instincts and raw power, these medieval humans were caught up in the absurdity of trying to control forces they didn't understand. But even worse, if you were living through the medieval period, you were not just subject to these ridiculous superstitions, you were also expected to follow the teachings of the church without question. You might think that as a dinosaur, you were free from the worries of being judged, punished, or controlled by a higher power. But in medieval times, you didn't have that luxury. The church dictated every aspect of your life: when you could marry, how you could behave, and even what you could think. If you dared to challenge the status quo, to ask a question about the validity of religious teachings, you could be labelled a heretic, and that often meant torture or execution. Imagine living in a world where questioning anything could lead to your untimely demise. No room for curiosity, no room for exploration, just the fear of divine punishment hanging over your head every day. Meanwhile, your dinosaur life consisted of survival, pure and simple. You didn't need to worry about divine retribution or the wrath of a higher power. You just lived. And what's even worse is the fact that the medieval world wasn't just filled with superstition, it was also incredibly inefficient. The medieval social systems, which were built on hierarchies and class divides, made everything more difficult. No matter what you were trying to do, whether you were trying to make a living as a merchant, protect your crops from thieves, or find some peace from the constant stress of survival, the systems in place often made your life harder than it had to be. You were constantly dependent on those above you for everything: your food, your land, your life, and the rules they set weren't necessarily based on reason. They were based on tradition and belief, which made them all the more frustrating. But the real punchline here is that the medieval world was full of people trying to navigate these systems and superstitions with no tools to actually make their lives better. They didn't have modern technology, modern medicine, or even a modern understanding of the world. They had beliefs, and a lot of them, as a T-Rex. You just survived on instinct, using your body and your mind to adapt to whatever the world threw at you. But in the medieval world, survival was about trying to make sense of a world that didn't make sense, trying to interpret the signs, follow the rules, and adhere to superstitions just to keep going. And if you didn't, you were out of luck. The medieval period was brutally unforgiving to those who didn't conform. So, to sum up the medieval experience, if you were a dinosaur, life was simple: eat, sleep, survive. The world didn't need to be explained, but in medieval society, you had to navigate a world filled with fear, superstition, and constant judgment. The fear of disease, the fear of war, the fear of social isolation. Everything about this world was a test of endurance. And unlike your dinosaur self, who didn't have to worry about politics, religion, or the supernatural, medieval humans had to worry about all of it. Survival wasn't just about being strong, it was about being clever, obedient, and always watching your back. And even then, it was never certain.